Now, I'm going to take a few moments here to give a quick overview of Bonaventure's Journey of the Mind to God. Now, I have listed here the 7 chapters of the book. It's a rather short work, and so I'm looking at this in the context of the broader theme of the ascent to God. All right, and so each step in this work is, in the first 6 steps anyway, they are steps towards the ascent to God. And chapter 7 is its own uh, beast, so to speak. All right, so as in the ascent to God that we see in people like Plato and Plotinus, especially Plotinus, the ascent to God is essentially it's you go up towards God, okay, by going into yourself, deeper within yourself. All right, so to go up to God, you go deep within yourself. So Bonaventure arranges his steps to God to reflect this. So first of all, the first 2 steps have to do with the external world, the world outside of us, and then steps 3 and 4 have to do with the world, have to do with the world within us, right? So inside of us. So we go into ourselves, into the mind, and then so this is the world outside, and here we're going inside us. That's an arrow. And then these final 2 steps are when we now look beyond us. Okay, so if I could draw a stick figure here. Okay, so at first you are looking at the world, examining the world, and that's helping you towards um, disciplining yourself and getting acquainted with God. And then you begin to go internally. You begin to look within yourself, and then you can finally begin to look up and appreciate God. And then chapter 7 is very different because at this point, you have to cease all activity. You stop at this point. Okay. So what it is here at at the end of chapter 6, if you get to this point, you are right there at the brink, and basically at this point you rest. That means there's really nothing the intellect can do at this point. It is more love. You have this intense love for God, and God grabs you and takes you at this point, and the mind is at rest. This is where all concepts begin to break down. Okay, and I will talk more about this in another video. All right, so just a few quick things here is step 1, which is the consideration of God through his vestiges in the universe. We just note that the word vestige sort of means something that's left over, like a remnant, right? So you could say something like, oh, the graduation ceremonies or graduation robes are a vestige of a medieval tradition. So something left over. You can walk maybe into a forest and you see a decaying house, and that's a vestige of something, someone who was there. So it's something that's left behind. It's a trace, okay, a trace or something that's left behind. And so in the first 2 steps, you are looking at the external world as vestiges of God. Like you see in them the organization of the world. You see how they are set up. You see their internal order, and they speak to you because they did not create themselves. And that order, the intelligibility of the world in itself, now speaks of something beyond itself. All right. So, but the thing is, these 2 steps are necessary, right? They are important. The first step towards self-discipline, learning how to discipline in some ways to quiet your physical senses. Now, the next 2 steps, now in these 2 steps here, you are now looking within the mind, and you see how the mind operates. You see the fact that it knows, it loves, it wills. And when you explore the natural powers of the mind, the natural abilities of the mind, then you begin to understand something about God. The fact that we're made in the image of God means that there's something about us that speaks to God's presence and being. Now, because our natural powers are not enough, that's because they have been weakened by sin. The next step is to look at our image that's reformed, look at into our minds that's reformed through grace, right? So at this point, this is where Christ comes in, so that the human mind that has been reformed by grace is not the perfect image of God, and you can then actually take another step. Okay, so the natural psychology is important in itself. It can't be discarded, but you have to go beyond that to see what the grace filled psychology is. What it is, what's a human being that's been reformed by grace, and that will tell you more about what God is. And then steps 5 and 6. Um, this is when you begin to look up towards God, and in this stage, you first come to understand God as being. So here we're beginning to understand the fact that God simply exists, and necessarily so, right? And he goes through a number of ideas, and he discusses quite a bit about the idea of being. So as a universal predicate, the idea that there has to be something rather than nothing. Okay, and that this is the first step to understanding God, that God necessarily is, right? And then once you come to terms with understanding this, so one point to note is steps 3 and 4. So I'll just say this: 2. You're disciplining your physical senses. So if I can get this right, there we go. And then steps 3 and 4, you're developing your spiritual senses. Okay, so when you've developed your spiritual senses, now you're able to experience 5 and 6. You're able to see God as being. And then more importantly, you see that when you understand being itself, you have to understand being primarily as the good. And when you understand being as the good, then you see God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So at this point, you've made your ascent, and this is where you stop. And then chapter 7 is where everything, all your concepts break down. At that point, God takes you, and you experience God in a primal fashion, in a way that you can't even begin to comprehend. So your intellect at this point, it gives up. It just simply rests, or it decomposes to some degree, and then you are simply absorbed into God, and you know God as you yourself are known. Okay, so those are the 6 steps that lead to the descriptions in chapter 7.